Well, hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of the podcast Thought Club. You are joining myself, Sats Solanki, as we digest some nuanced thoughts around cultural topics, just things that I'm thinking about. We'll have some guests on at some point as well. Let me just encourage you really quickly, if you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're listening via podcast, please also subscribe so that you can keep getting this content coming your way. I hope you are enjoying it, and please share with somebody who might like to hear this as well. That's entirely up to you, but appreciate you tuning in. And in this week's episode, we are talking about evolution and morality. Evolution and morality. And gosh, there's a big conversation here. And part of what we've been looking at so far is the implications of our thinking. That we talked last time about universal truth. Go check it out. That the implications of the way that we think about one thing has to continue through. If we're inconsistent in the way that we think, then we don't really think what we think. Or if we think one thing but we say and do another thing, kind of shows that we don't really believe those things. We have to see it in alignment, a holistic, universal truth that flows through the way I interact with others, the way I interact with myself, and so on. And I really do believe that the evolution and the associated conclusions that you must draw from it and how that affects morality really are very inconsistent. And so I'm not going to go deep into science today because I'm not a scientist, and we could all read things on the internet, but what I really want to look at is the kind of philosophy and the just psychological implications for what that means in our everyday life. Now, evolution is a kind of commonly socially accepted, idea, theory, science. Trust the science, bro. And it's just, hey, these are the origins of the Earth. And I want to just speak into that. For anyone who doesn't know, evolution it's the idea that the origin of the species, that firstly the world has occurred through natural means, but that through mutation of cells, genetics over time, humanity has trended upwards and evolved into where we are today. That would be the commonly accepted scientific explanation. Add something to it if you like. I'm sure I'm not doing it full justice, but it's the idea that mutations over time have taken us from being single-celled, really simple organisms into being complex, the creatures that we are today, the people that we are today, with music and art and creativity and intimacy and all of the amazing things that we can see in the world around us. And first, I've just got to say, just as a very simple reflection, I think it's really interesting that the basis of the theory of evolution is around the idea that mutations trend upwards instead of downwards. In other words, that things are naturally getting better instead of naturally getting worse. I think that's a really interesting thought, because actually when I think about my real world experience, or even just scientifically, if we were to analyze what happens to stuff when we leave it alone, it tends to mutate into chaos and destruction and mold. And I remember as a kid, whatever reason, I didn't eat my lunch that day as like a 9-year-old or something, and I just shoved the sandwiches under my bed like you do when you're 9 years old, and forgot about it until probably 8 months later, and pulled out these sandwiches with this sandwich bag, thinking, what is this? It was unrecognizable, the amount of mold and color, and just, this is a reminder to me that things don't mutate upwards, they generally tend to mutate downwards. And that doesn't mean that it's impossible, but I just think it's interesting that that's a fairly recognized just thing for us as human beings. But what I want to focus on today is I want to focus on the implications of what evolution means for us. Because a lot of us might just say, yeah, that's cool, I'm cool with that, but never follow through to use the words of Thelma, who messaged me after last week's podcast. She said, we don't tend to unpick where our thoughts have come from. We just think what we think, and we don't question where it's come from. And I think as we talk about evolution, that's actually a massive thing, because we don't stop to unpick and think about the implications of what that means for us, namely morality. So the survival of the fittest, that's the term that gets used a lot. And so, it's the idea that over millions and millions and a very long time, organisms, cells have evolved, the best ones have survived, and it keeps going through this process like a gazillion times until you end up today, the survival of the fittest. And so we arrive in today, and isn't it interesting that although there is a kind of natural survival of the fittest, people who are more intelligent, people who are stronger, people who are better connected, people who have better resources, people who come from a better family, etc., are going to be much more likely to succeed by all worldly metrics, at least. But although that is true, there is also this deep concern for those who are less fortunate, particularly in Western society. We don't just think, well, you know, if you've got the genes, great, but if you're having a tough time, or you've come from a broken family, or you're homeless, or whatever category we want to put on there that would disadvantage someone, we don't just go, oh, well, tough luck. And I think if we did, you know, we'd get some funny looks from people around us, that none of us really want to be part of a world where that's how we treat people, where we treat people based on their evolutionary strength. We say, well, you're the fittest one, so great. Even though naturally we all want to be at the top of the pub, we all want to be doing well in life, but still there is a compassion or a care or a love or just a sense in us of morality, that we should use the things that we have, the advantages and privileges that we may have acquired or received, and we should use those to help other people. And you know, I kind of think if you follow through evolution, it doesn't really make sense. Like, why do we have that desire? Where does that come from? Because everything about survival of the fittest is orientated to me, myself, and I. You know, me as, you know, to survive, to get ahead. And evolution says that to get ahead, everybody else had to not get ahead. That's literally how it worked. So you know, if I'm number one out of you know, 10 or 10 billion, that the other 9 billion and whatever that number is have to die for me to get ahead. And that's how the mutations have worked. That I have got here theoretically on the back of the deaths and the oppression of everybody else who came before me. So why wouldn't I continue to live out that natural pathway today in this age where I just say, well, I'm ahead, I live in the UK, I've got access to better resources and education. Why should I care about the rest of the world or people who are less fortunate than me? Why should I care? Because evolution actually dictates that this is the way I'm supposed to think. So why would I stop using the very thing that got me to where I am before, that I have traveled through being more fortunate, surviving, being the fittest, and I arrive at this point? Why should I now change my thinking to consider other people who are less fortunate than me? Why? Why should we consider that when you think that the very DNA in us has been formulated by this idea that a lot of people have to miss out so that I can get to where I am today? And yet, of course, that sort of thinking is so strange today. We all want to consider other people, and evolution doesn't really leave any space for that consideration in morality. Now, one of the thoughts might be, well, there's a sense of social cohesion, that we have recognized that, you know, when everybody comes together and works together, you know, and as a community, then we're most likely to survive. Well, that may or may not be true, because I think a lot of the time that's also not true. If you have something that I want, and you know, you've got like a pen, and I want that pen, but it's your pen. You found it, you made it, you bought it, whatever. You know, what's to stop me from taking what is yours and getting it? If I'm stronger than you, then I can just come over, I can overpower you, I can take that. That is my evolutionary right, so to speak, of the survival of fittest that is in my psychology now for millions upon millions of years, that I'm allowed to do that. And you might say, well, that's the thing, is that will break social cohesion, and so it's best that we have laws that stop people from doing that. And so I might say, okay, I'm going to respect social cohesion and social kind of just community, that the displeasure of others. And so that what that means, which is a possibility, you know, we all do feel social pressure to do what is best for the group and not to act up or do things that are destructive. But what that means is, if we were to get rid of the laws, if we were to get rid of the social responsibility and the community pressure, are we saying that we would still be comfortable with that? If it was just me and you, Cain and Abel, and no one else was there, and no one else would ever see, does that mean that it's okay for me to take something you have? Does it mean that I can spill your blood to get ahead because that's where I've come from? In fact, it just kind of is where we've been. It's in my DNA. Surely I'm excused from thinking in that way. And of course, all of us would feel, no, that doesn't feel quite right. Or perhaps if you do think that's quite right, maybe it depends on your perspective on whether you're Cain or whether you're Abel. Because here's the thing, when you're in power, when you are better resourced, when you have support and team and people backing your corner, it's very easy to oppress others. It's very easy to think, well, that seems totally fair for me, because of course Cain is going to think that it's totally fair. But if you're poor old Abel over here, gosh, that doesn't seem too good. And so we find ourselves on this natural trajectory where the oppressed become more oppressed, and those who are in power become more powerful, and the strong become stronger, because that's what evolution is all about. Survival of the fittest. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we are in a point where that sort of thinking, for most of us, I'm sure, listening, is, incomprehensible that we would consider that, and yet that is the logical outcome of the theory of evolution, that we would end up in that space where I look out for me. And even the idea that I would, consider morality from a social perspective is utterly selfish. Like for me to say, oh, it's better for me not to steal or kill because so that people like me and people get on with me, so I'm not going to commit things like that. That's entirely about me. And each of us, all of us, have this aversion to that thinking, even though we're prone to it, even though we're prone to preferring ourselves to pride, to taking care of number one. Each of us still have this moral ideal, seems to be hard-coded in us, that we desire to be like people who sacrifice. We desire to be people who give. We desire to be people. We respect people who are generous and not self-serving and others-orientated, and yet everything in our DNA should be telling us the opposite. There's a massive question here. So I want to end this episode just flicking onto a little bit of a serious topic around abortion. And it's been in the news recently. In Texas, I believe the laws have just changed. I don't fully understand the legal implications of it, but I believe what it means is that the abortion is, it's after 6 weeks. If someone had an abortion, theoretically any member of the public could sue anybody who'd been involved, the doctors, the person, etc., for up to, I think, $10,000, something like that. So it's a pretty massive law. There's a lot of chatter about it, and I want to just throw this in as a very real today example. And there's a few things we're gonna talk about, because this is a big topic, and I don't just want to give like a, but I do want to relay it into the conversation around morality and evolution, because according to evolution, as far as I can see, there's no inconsistency between the position of evolution and abortion. It's survival of the fittest. And I hate to talk about it in these terms, because I've got 4 kids, and it's very real when you put yourself in a situation, and it's almost impossible not to. I think that's why it's such an emotionally charged conversation at times, is because every person from all sides, whether that's someone who has been in abusive relationships, or somebody who's been coerced into doing something, or somebody who has kids, or people who've been through miscarriage, there's so much emotion in this conversation. So I'm really not trying to make any quick judgments here, but I think what I do want to just look at is the morality and the philosophy between evolution and abortion. Abortion makes sense because it says, I need to survive, I need to get ahead, therefore this fetus, this baby, however we want to describe what is in the womb, if that's not convenient, if that's not going to help me evolve to become strong, to get to the top of the hierarchy, then it just makes sense to sort that out, to abort that baby. Now here's the problem we have with that line of thinking, because there's one huge question, which is, at what point does that fetus, that baby, become viable? So there's clearly a point, for example, after birth, where we would say that is absolutely wrong. I think it's very few people in our world who would say, no, that's totally cool. And actually, interesting enough, in ancient times, infanticide was completely common. That is, killing of infants, children, convenience. Often it was because they were female rather than male, because of the social, cultural implications of what that would mean. They would often kill the child. And it's horrible. It's absolutely tragic when you think about it. But there is a huge question, which is, at what point does a fetus become a baby? And I'm deliberately using both of those words just because I want to leave it open for you to decide, right? But at what point, from conception of sperm and egg coming together to development and growth, where do you choose where that baby, that fetus, is an inconvenience, or I know it's not as simple as that, but is something we can get rid of? And at what point does that become a moral issue where we say, oh no, that's a line we cannot cross? And for me, there's only one logical place you can draw that line, depending on your viewpoint. And so I'll give you some options. One is, of course, at conception. Life begins at conception. That's the safest place to draw the line, where you can say, well, actually, this is a human life beginning. The other place is at birth. And the other argument that is used is around whether the baby is viable outside of the womb. So, if that baby could survive outside of the womb, then it's viable, and therefore we're now morally obligated to protect that baby. But here's something I just want to throw into the mix, which is a shocking thought. But I think if you follow the consistency of thought through, it's impossible not to come to this conclusion, because that question about viability is really a very evolutionary concept. That is that thing going to survive or not? Is that baby going to survive? Is it going to make it through the millions of generations, the billions of generations of survival to be able to earn its right to survive in this world? Here's the thing you got to realize is that it takes quite a long time for a baby after birth to be able to fend for itself. I mean, definitely, I don't even know where to draw the line, but let's just make it super, super obvious. Entirely in the first year, that baby needs food, needs caring. It cannot survive on its own. So if we are to make an argument around viability, we really need to expand. If we really believe that morality, it's pre-birth but not after birth, we really should put it all in the same thing. Abortion and infanticide is exactly the same logic. And I'm not here making a moral judgment, so I don't know where you're coming from on this. I don't know what your personal experience is. I'm just saying that logically, it's the same thing. Logically. And if we want to be logical people, and we believe that we are a product of the mutation of cells arriving at this point, then that seems a perfectly acceptable position from a logical perspective. I guess the huge question is morality. And then we go, well, how do we determine what our morality is? I suppose the Christian perspective is around the sanctity of life, which is the idea that every human being is made in the image of God. With evolution, you don't have that. If you're a product of just cells, then why should I respect you? Why should I take care of you? Why should I treat you as anything different than a tree, anything different than a plant, anything different than the soil and the ground? And that is not my position. I hope you can pick up on that. But there really is no reason. And the only reason is, but it's me. I'm a person, I'm a human being, and we can apply that logic to other people, but when other people apply it to us, we kick off. That's not fair. That's not right. When people apply that line of thinking to people we love and care about, there's something in us. An invisible radar for morality and justice begins to awaken. There's not one human being that seems to not have that written in their DNA, almost as if it was crafted, etched in there. The product of generations upon generations of moral code that has been given to us, I believe, by God. Evolution doesn't give space for that. Evolution says you are where you are because you've got ahead of everybody else. And the only way to keep going is to apply that same principle, the idea that mutation will continue to better. But I believe that when we follow that sort of principle and that sort of thinking, we don't actually get ahead. Things actually get worse because mutation always seems to trend downwards, not upwards. Leave people alone. Don't give them guidance. Don't teach your children. The next generation doesn't get better without education and care and input. They get worse. And so there's some huge question marks for me around this whole concept of evolution. Probably just the last thing I'll just end on really quickly is just the idea that maybe from just to focus on a Christian perspective that hey, maybe God caused evolution. I have to say that that's a very popular idea because for a lot of Christians who've maybe grown up with the Bible and to keep social cohesion, it's easy to say, yeah, I believe in evolution and I believe in God. But I have to say it's a very inconsistent position when you look at the doctrine of sin, when you look at the doctrine of the sanctity of life. Because are we to believe that God created humans and the process that he created humans was to sacrifice millions upon millions of organisms before them? At which point did people become human? And were the people before that point, did they have spirits? Did they have souls? Were they subhuman? We've seen all sorts of terrible things in our world come about by this idea that some people are subhuman. Incredible racism, discrimination, and all sorts of genocide and all sorts has come out of this idea that some people are higher than others. For me, it's a very dangerous idea. It doesn't fit with the Bible. I think it's up to you. You can choose, but I think it's a very inconsistent position. I'd rather you just said, I believe everything came from natural causes, or I believe everything came created by God. But I do think you have to follow through. You can't attach morality to things that don't make sense just because it makes you feel comfortable. You've got to follow the whole thing the whole way through. And I think when we really dig deep, there's some pretty big questions to answer there. Anyway, thanks for joining today for this episode. We've gone deep, we've gone dark, we've gone intense, but I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been helpful, and I would love to hear what you think. These are big conversations, and maybe you've got some thoughts of your own. Hit subscribe on YouTube if you're watching, on podcast if you're listening, and hook me up on Instagram at Sats Solanki. Drop me a DM, and please do share this with somebody who might find this intriguing, fascinating, whatever their religion, whatever their creed, whatever their ideology, their philosophy. I think it's just cool to have conversations and to explore ideas. I'm not trying to be an expert in everything. I'm just trying to explore what makes sense to me, and hopefully together we can figure out some cool things about how to best live our lives and get some good thinking in the process. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you soon.